So good evening. Thank you for joining me tonight. This is my first time out to Mount Holly, and it's a pleasure getting to drive downtown. Definitely someplace I need to bring my family back to hang out for an evening. Before I begin about my talk, I'd certainly like to thank Nancy for coordinating this event. I think we originally scheduled it months and months ago when I finally had a free evening to be here. So I'd like to thank her and certainly thank you all for coming out. My brief glance when I got in here kind of rushed a little late, but the Historical Society looks really fantastic. I'm going to have to peek around if I can afterwards, get maybe a mini tour. One of the things I try to do at the beginning of all of my book talks is convey that this was not necessarily a work of one individual person. I get to put my name as author on there, but there are certainly some important individuals at the University of Alabama Press that helped this along, and certainly my series editors that are affiliated with different universities across the Southeast. And while they're not here, I like to know that I've thanked them, and they are Chris Ray over at UNC Wilmington, Angela Blake Hudson over at Texas A&M, and Andrew Frank down at FSU. They all have fantastic work on Southeastern Native American history as well, if you are looking for other authors and other books to read about. So, I will give a little bit of an introduction to myself, expand a little bit about who I am and what I do. As Nancy mentioned, I'm affiliated with the University of South Carolina Lancaster. We are a 2-year branch college within the University of South Carolina system. I am an assistant professor of history there, and also the historian for the Native American Studies Center. So we'd certainly like to welcome you all to make the hour-ish plus drive on a no traffic day to come and visit us down there. We are in downtown Lancaster, right next to a really great barbecue restaurant, so a good place to come for lunch and come check out our museum space as well. Got a couple shots up here of our museum. We have events pretty regularly, cultural festivals at the end of our spring and fall semester. That shot in the middle there, that's my daughter taking advantage of one of the stomp dance instructions from somebody who came up to do some demonstrations. So they're family friendly, open to the public, wonderful events to come and enjoy. In addition to these types of events, we have museum space. We have the largest collection of Catawba pottery now anywhere in the world for you to come and look at. And then we have rotating exhibits going in and out all year long, it feels like. I think one of our current large exhibits is looking at indigenous peoples down in the Low Country. So Charleston, we certainly know about its Civil War history, its colonial history, but it was and still is home to native South Carolinians. And we've got some exhibits testifying to that. So, let me see here. Let's get into what I'd like to share with you about my work. So, as I talk about the research that went into my book today, I want to ask you to sort of reconceptualize maybe a little bit about what we think about the American South. And I want to start this in a place that is fairly recognizable to how we portray the American South, how we think about the American South, especially that pre-Civil War era South, that old South that it's often referred to as. And generally, something like this image comes to mind. Probably nothing is more synonymous with our idea of this old South than the plantation system. And I'd be willing to guess that several people in this room have at one point in their lives taken a plantation tour. I know I have, gone down to Charleston, done plenty. These are pretty prolific heritage tourism opportunities throughout the American South. And their interpretations are sometimes great and sometimes a little bit skewed, depending on where you go. In Charleston, I'd recommend McLeod Plantation. It's a really fantastic one to get a complete picture of what these plantation systems were like. But the plantation pictured here is a little bit unique. To give you guys some reference, this is in northern Georgia, and it's the home of James Vann. It's completed in 1804, pretty typical time period. And when James Van dies, the home, and it's approximately 2,000 acres, and nearly 100 enslaved people will pass down to Joseph. Again, fairly typical for plantation owners in the area during the time period. However, Joseph, the son, is not going to be able to pass along this inherited wealth to his children. In 1834, Joseph Van and his family are going to be evicted from their property. The reason why is because the Van family were Cherokee citizens living on Cherokee land, but after the passage of the Indian Removal Act. The Van family, along with about another 16,000 Cherokees, are going to be forcibly expelled from their homes in the 1830s to be relocated to modern-day Oklahoma. So before that happens, they're going to be rounded up, held in detention camps under armed guard by the U.S. military, where actually the majority of the casualties of the Trail of Tears for the Cherokee will occur. 3,000 Cherokee will die while in detention camps. Another 1,000 will die making the trek west. This travesty, this atrocity, becomes infamously known as the Trail of Tears. So, the reason I wanted to start with this example about the Van plantation is to ask you to reconsider how we think about the American South. Here we have an icon of the region in this plantation home, but it was one that was owned and operated by a Cherokee family. And in 1830, this Cherokee family was actually one of the wealthiest families in Georgia. And they are fully leveraging the South's plantation system to their advantage. They're well immersed in the modern plantation economy of the day. So certainly, yes, we do see a defining feature of the South's history in this story of plantations and enslavement. And beyond this, we've seen historians, academics have sort of combated with each other about other definitive features of the American South. These have typically included things like the region's agrarian past, its agricultural focus, conservative politics and religion, certainly, even the climate, its heat and humidity as shaping the culture and identity of the South. And even more recently, scholars have been looking at how Southern cuisine becomes a defining component of what defines this region. But what I'm going to share with you today, what my research has been about, tells a story of how Native Americans are going to play a far more important role in defining the experience and defining the history of the American South and really forging this unification of this white Southern culture in the antebellum period. And we're going to see ways, hopefully, I'll be able to explain to you in which that legacy continues on even today. So most people are likely aware of the Trail of Tears or the Indian Removal Act. These are certainly momentous moments in American history, and for the South, they are cornerstone events that shape its past and its geography. The story usually goes something along the lines of Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, and then all of the Native Americans are expelled west to Oklahoma. And then, and certainly dated history classes, Native Americans are really never else mentioned again in the South, maybe again in the Western Plains with American expansion. But Native people will remain. The Catawba Reservation is not too far from where I teach. There are about almost a dozen other state-recognized indigenous groups or communities in the state of South Carolina, and certainly plenty of others around the Southeast. So when we look at how this history has been somewhat incompletely taught, sometimes there is an acknowledgement of the injustices of this entire process. Over the course of the 1830s, of the 1840s, before the American Civil War, federal officials had acquired illegitimate agreements to seize Native American land across the eastern United States in exchange for this land in the West. Upwards of 80,000 Native Americans are going to be expelled from their homelands. 10,000 Native Americans, more than just the Cherokee, will die as a direct result of Indian removal. And we see by 1840, less than 20,000 native people living east of the Mississippi River. But they will remain. But we often see how the history of this experience is taught is one of complete expulsion, of erasure. And part of that is a testament to how the region has remembered its past, what it is focused on in terms of trying to understand what has happened. So when we talk about Indian removal, one of the things that often happens is to artificially limit the discussion of Indian removal to that 1830 Indian Removal Act or the experience of the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears. But when we look at a broader view of U.S. history, going all the way back to the first colonial foundings on the East Coast, we see this process of outsiders seizing and then occupying native land, something we refer to as dispossession, is not something that occurs in a single moment or even in a single decade. What we can broadly refer to as Indian removal is much wider and much more persistent in terms of the longer view of American history. Indian removals very much begin with the colonization of the Americas. They are going to very much be a part of the American Revolution, and they are largely going to be standard U.S. policy throughout the 19th century. So the premise of my work really looks to consider the centrality of this indigenous dispossession and the forced expulsion of Native Americans in shaping American history, in particular shaping the American South. When we put this in sort of a big picture view of something I'm trying to accomplish and what many other scholars like me are trying to accomplish, is that hopefully we can impart an expanded understanding of the American South that it is essential to look at the impact that Native Americans have had on their region. And time again, we see that violence often goes hand in hand with both Indian removal and the legacy of how this process is remembered. Purging indigenous peoples from the region is an inherently violent event that leaves an impact on those directly involved. We see for generations that follow, the memories of this violence is going to resonate, it is going to be reinterpreted, and eventually even celebrated, as you can see by some of these monuments behind me. This is why I have these three pictured here. Each of these monuments commemorates a family or an individual who suffered while Native Americans in the South attempted to defend their homeland. On the far left here is a statue of Lemuel Montgomery. He is going to be from Tennessee, join a volunteer militia at the start of the 1813 Creek War that takes place in modern-day central Alabama. Lemuel Montgomery is going to be immortalized because he is part of the wave that ends the Creek War at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. What he does is he is the first one over the defensive works that the Red Stick Creeks have put up to defend their home at town Tohopeka. He'll be the first over the breastworks. He will be shot and killed. And for this, he will be immortalized. This statue pictured here is going to be put in front of an Alabama courthouse in 1987, so relatively recently. In the middle, the United Daughters of the Confederacy will place a monument in 1933 over the graves of the Hampton family, who will be killed in the Cherokee War of 1776. That begins alongside the American Revolution. The Hampton family will have survivors and become influential family in South Carolina politics. So much so that Wade Hampton III will get this large cavalry statue of him and be, again, immortalized in the memory of the state of South Carolina. And then on the right, we have something that isn't quite as widely known and certainly a bit more subtle than these other monuments and statues, but one that struck me in my research as unexpected. On the right here is the gravesite of Jane Johns. Jane Johns is going to be living in Florida at the time of the Second Seminole War. That's going to be something that's going to be the focus of my talk quite a bit today. The Second Seminole War is an effort by the Florida Indians to try and oppose their removal from the peninsula. To do so, they will attack settlers, military who are encroaching on their land. And Jane Johns is going to be a victim of this defensive assault by the Florida Indians. In 1836, her homestead is going to be attacked. She will be scalped, but she will survive. Jane Johns will live until 1874, living the rest of her later life with a brother-in-law. But much later, more than a century later, in 1985, there will be a local historical society in Florida that places this grave marker pictured here commemorating the violence against her. And if you can see on the caption there, basically has her name and then scalped, September 16th, 1836. What is even further unusual about this gravesite is that's the only thing that marks her grave. She doesn't have a traditional headstone. So these are examples and ways in which the violence of Indigenous removal is remembered and at times celebrated in American memory. And one of the things that I focus in my work that I hope to convey to you today is to explain how this violence between white settlers and Native Americans very much create this culturally distinctive region we think of as the South. That this violence of dispossession is going to become ingrained in sort of this white Southern psyche to bind people together. Geographically, this is a widespread process that interconnects many Southern spaces, from the Carolinas down to Florida, west into Louisiana and Texas. My work has examined episodes of violence that range from certainly wars like the Creek War or the Second Seminole War, but also interpersonal conflict and how those sort of smaller scale interactions, beginning as far back as the mid-1700s through the mid-19th century, are portrayed and remembered. So often, in the aftermath of these violent encounters, the memories that get passed on from one generation to the next reinforce white Southerners' sense of regionalism and reinforce their claims to the land, their ability to call themselves Southerners. Throughout the 19th century, white Southerners are going to retell, they're going to embellish, they're going to glamorize tales of conquest and dispossession. They're going to portray themselves as heroes, but also victims to future generations. To frame my research, I borrow from anthropologists who have developed models for the formation of historic Indigenous communities. Traditionally, what they refer to as the concept of coalescence is used to trace basically the unification of Indigenous peoples as they respond to the pressures of outsiders. This is how we get many of the historic Indigenous communities that we recognize today. Groups like the Creek, groups like the Seminole, going a little bit further west, the Choctaw and Chickasaw as well. So, to explain the unification of the White South, I use this model of coalescence to emphasize the cooperation and the obligations that are going to be shared among white settlers through violence against Native people. So as settler violence victimizes Native communities as they force them out of their homelands, Native efforts to defend their homes will facilitate this unification or coalescence of white Southerners as they conversely work together. So time and time again, we see white Southerners across the region are going to come together in response to these perceived threats from Native opposition. And often, as we see in these monuments that I showed on the previous slide, that the aftermath of the violence against Native people, white communities will pass down local memories that very much personalize this violence as heroic acts done in self-defense. So, creating the title of my book emphasizes this duality between being the perpetrator of violence and then also claiming the victimization of this violence. And this led me to zero in on this premise of aggression and sufferings. Unfortunately, I can't claim that this title was something I came up entirely on my own. The phrase aggression and sufferings is something I borrowed from an 1823 publication by John Haywood called The Civil and Political History of Tennessee. Haywood is going to be a settler who arrives in Tennessee in the early 1800s. He's originally from North Carolina. He'll move to Middle Tennessee with his family, settling in basically the Nashville area. Once in Tennessee, Haywood's going to be pretty successful. He's going to work as a lawyer, a state Supreme Court judge, and then also an author. And one of Haywood's books, The Civil and Political History of Tennessee, actually offers one of the first historical accounts on the formation of this state when it's published in 1823. Haywood is going to do what many of these early 19th century historians do. They don't have a ton of documents to work from, so they're going to go and talk to the settlers in the area, basically collect oral histories, learn of stories that have been passed down through generations. And in his Civil and Political History of Tennessee, Haywood is going to repeat these stories, and many of them essentially heap praise upon the first white settlers of Tennessee, but many of these family stories force him to confront how much of the settlement of Middle Tennessee is going to coincide with violence with Native Americans. Several families have stories of how their ancestors or their first generation of arrivals were attacked by Indians in the area. And in recounting one instance that Haywood dates back to 1792, he's going to write, "Such was the irreconcilable hatred which the Indians and whites had contracted for each other by a long continued course of aggression and suffering, that it was almost as impossible for the government of the United States to restrain some of their citizens from acts of enmity, as it was for the Indian chiefs to restrain and keep within their bounds all those who were in their nations." So this quote gives us sort of two different perspectives, one in which he is characterizing the history of Middle Tennessee as one scarred by violence between settlers and Native Americans. But it is also one that gives us an opportunity to examine the memory of these events in terms of not just that there was this violence, but how that legacy of violence carried through generations. So this characterization of Indians and settlers in this perpetual state of violence that gets galvanized in community memories is one that I encountered over and over again in my research, whether I was in Columbia, South Carolina, or Baton Rouge, Louisiana. These same similar types of stories kept popping up. And they gradually developed into a wider regional view, where these repetitious attempts to often make false equivalencies of invaders as victims shaped how white Southerners at the time justified their settlement and expulsion of the region's native inhabitants. So, as I alluded to, the Second Seminole War that takes place in Florida is going to be an event that is very formative for the consciousness of the white American South. During my research in particular, a crystallizing moment came when looking at South Carolina's relationship to this war that takes place in Florida. Anybody who's seen a map of the United States knows that South Carolina does not share a border with Florida, and that South Carolinians are in no immediate danger from this war that is going on in Florida. But still, South Carolinians, particularly the city of Charleston, is going to be rabid in its insistence on going to war against the Florida Indians. And they are really going to lead the charge at every opportunity to start and accelerate this conflict. For a little bit of context, the Second Seminole War is going to take place in Florida from 1835 to 1842, and this conflict is a direct response to the 1830 Indian Removal Act of the federal government's effort to forcibly relocate the Seminole from the Florida Peninsula. The Florida Indians are fighting back against this attempted expulsion. So in their efforts to remain in their homes, Native Americans in Florida will go to war against the United States. The Florida Indians' efforts to defend themselves will first begin by looking within. They will purge pro-removal leaders within their midst, people that are not dedicated to the cause of staying within their homelands. They will then turn against federal officials and military targets within their lands, one of which will be memorialized for generations to come with the battle, with Dade's battle. Then these Seminole raiding parties will attack settler homesteads that are living within their territory and along their borders. something that Jane Johns gets caught up in. For the Florida Indians, this opening salvo of the Second Seminole War in late 1835 was an immense success. They're going to be able to successfully assassinate the local federal official that was tasked with overseeing their forced expulsion. They are then going to be able to annihilate 2 U.S. Army companies at Dade's Battle, killing 110 men and leaving only 2 survivors. And by the start of 1836, white settlers along Seminole borders are abandoning their homesteads and plantations in panic. But this success of Florida's indigenous peoples is going to quickly spark a backlash that resonates across the South. Southerners and communities from South Carolina to Louisiana are going to rally to the defense of these Florida settlers that they see as being unjustly attacked and victimized by these Florida Indians. Southerners, particularly in the states of South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, are going to do things like mail petitions to their state governors, mail petitions to the federal government, all for advocating for the protection of Florida settlers. Thousands will volunteer for service in this oncoming war. And in a very short amount of time, white Southerners who were actively advocating for the protection of Florida settlers will turn to using terms of familial obligation. They will frequently begin referring to the white Floridians as their Florida brethren. And in cities like southern cities, from the Carolinas to Louisiana, common citizens, local municipalities, city governments are going to begin organizing militia companies to send to Florida. And this collective martial enthusiasm is going to prompt coordinated action, not just in towns, but across state lines, often between governors communicating with one another, to basically collaboratively develop a strategy on how best to send troops to Florida and defend the Florida communities, defend the Florida's white communities already on the peninsula. So we see within just a year of the war's start, one South Carolinian is going to go so far as to claim that these cooperative efforts at the start of the conflict against the Florida Indians, in my words, forge a coalescence of the white South as a people, but in his words, as he wrote, these people were emanating from one family in the collective defense of their suffering brethren. So as I've mentioned, no city was likely more zealous for this conflict against the Seminole than Charleston, South Carolina. By December of 1835, men in the city are going to be basically organizing volunteer militias for deployment. Local newspapers, clipping that's pictured here, are going to almost daily report on the meetings taking place, on the efforts taking place to gather men, gather weapons, gather supplies, to make, if need be, the march to Florida, but preferably the voyage to Florida by sea. We're going to see that there's going to be some widespread civic support across the city of Charleston. The city mayor at the time, Robert Hayne, is going to offer to provide an advance payment for volunteers who need weapons and supplies. So while these are volunteers, while city municipal codes might expect them to be able to muster with a rifle and supplies, not every man actually has one. So the city will offer to provide it for them. One of the city's wealthiest individuals, Wade Hampton II, will actually offer his own personal line of credit to borrow against to outfit volunteers if the city or individual militia companies come up short. So by the next month, January 1836, men attending a town hall meeting are going to request that the Charleston City Council officially allocate funds to transport men and purchase provisions for any volunteer willing to enlist. So by the end of January 1836, the U.S. Secretary of War will formally authorize the local military liaison, a guy by the name of Abraham Eustis, who is stationed in Charleston, to begin officially receiving volunteer companies for deployment to Florida. But it quickly becomes apparent that Eustis discovers the South Carolinians' eagerness basically exceeds the call for volunteers and the U.S. military's capacity to transport these men who want to go fight Indians in Florida. Eustis is actually forced to decline the services of at least 2 Charleston militia companies due to the lack of enough ships. The city of Charleston, though, is going to pitch in. They will not be deterred in sending every available man who wants to go to Florida. The local newspapers are going to report that the companies were determined to proceed to the scene of action, and a local steamboat captain is going to offer to transport the men free of charge. So, these events are going to work to bring men together across ethnic and class lines. While Charleston is going to be the hotbed of action, we certainly see volunteer companies reporting from across the state, from across the Piedmont, the Midlands, and the Low Country. From 1835 to 1839, more than 2,000 South Carolinians are going to volunteer to serve in Florida. Georgia and Alabama will send an equal number of troops as well. Kershaw County, not far from where I teach, will muster 3 companies after their own series of town hall meetings. Lancaster County, where my institution is located, is going to contribute another company in what the press reports was much larger numbers than was requested. Again, an overflow of volunteerism to go to Florida to fight the Seminole. Alongside what appears in historic newspapers, there are going to be a few participants who will document what basically inspires them to volunteer for this conflict. There are going to be a few diaries, a few journals that basically give us a first-person account of this fervor in 1835 and 1836. In one instance, a volunteer named Myra M. Cohen is going to detail his involvement in the Charleston city's public meetings, and where he serves as the committee's secretary, and then will later serve as a volunteer in Florida as well. And Myra M. Cohen is by no means a professional soldier. Cohen is born in 1804. He's going to work as a school headmaster and then a lawyer. And he describes, though, his motivation to volunteer as a wild wish for adventure. Cohen is going to also generalize that Charleston citizenry at large basically felt much the same way. So across the city of Charleston, there's going to be a broad range of ethnicities and professions who will rally to this cause as well. We're going to see the city's German immigrants form at least 2 different volunteer companies. The city's Irish volunteer militia will prepare for deployment as well. In addition to this ethnic diversity of the volunteers, men are going to come from a wide array of lifestyles and professions. This will include students, mechanics, lawyers such as Myra M. Cohen, politicians as well. In at least one instance, there's a story of a 14-year-old boy who insists on serving and volunteers as well. So in similar fashion, South Carolina women will celebrate the volunteers heading to Florida. Women's civic service will center on organizing events or displaying literary talents, basically supporting the war effort in ways that they can. One person individual is an actor named Charlotte Barnes, and she is going to author and likely perform what is very blurrily pictured in front of you, typescript, very small here, but I'll read out some important quotes. But Charlotte Barnes is going to use this basically volunteer promotional literature to motivate and celebrate those who are going to Florida. Her poetry is going to describe soldiers heading to Florida as common family men who are basically willing to risk their lives to defend their fellow countrymen against what she describes actually as an invading enemy. So, in romantic tones, I'm going to recite a little bit of poetry here. It's certainly not my strong suit. But Barnes is going to portray the volunteers as son, a brother, a husband, and father, casting aside, in her words, all private gain in their honorable venture to Florida. Barnes's poetry will describe how, she says, a sister land sends forth a wailing cry, and to that call those gallant hearts reply. So again, this association with a familiar relation with the Florida settlers. She continues, in tearing themselves from those they love, Barnes states the volunteers committed to defending what she calls our native land against invading stranger foes. So framing indigenous people as outsiders and Charlestonians, South Carolinians going to Florida as native to this space. So, Barnes's work is going to continue describing the efforts of these volunteers as in arms against a common foe, and when they land, and when that land revives in peace, its people far and near will join in thanks and gratitude to the generous volunteer. Barnes never specifically identifies the Seminole. She largely relies on tropes and stereotypes and slanders against indigenous people. Barnes portrays Florida Indians as an enemy engaged in a dishonorable campaign of terror and violence that is desecrating a colonial possession now in need of South Carolinians' protection. Barnes's poetry is going to provide this deliberate frame for the perspective of white Southerners to justify them traveling to Florida, invading Seminole land. The structure of her prose portrays white settlers in Florida as natives and Native Americans as outsiders. She outright calls indigenous people invaders. And so we see these types of trends, not just limited to poetry, but also to political rhetoric of the day, histories written of this era, in this era, to portray this conflict that is going to go on until into the 1840s. So we're going to see it isn't just South Carolinians joining the war. Volunteers from South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Louisiana are going to number into the thousands fighting alongside Florida settlers. Between 1835 and 1839, more than 16,000 militiamen will aid in this effort to expel Florida's indigenous people. We see as volunteers of 1836 return home, some of them will begin to reflect on their collaborative efforts. Volunteers will go to great lengths to basically celebrate the honor of one another and celebrate the righteousness of this common cause. After his service, we can look to Myron M. Cohen again, returning to Charleston and then authoring one of the first histories of the Second Seminole War. He is doing this very prematurely, though. Cohen's Notices of Florida and the Campaigns, published in 1836, will precede the conclusion of this conflict by about 6 years, but it gives us some insights to these early stages of the war and the perspective that men like Cohen had in terms of both volunteering, but also the consequences and legacy of their service. So, Cohen is going to widely celebrate not just white South Carolinians, but white Southerners at large who serve in Florida and describe them as gallant sons of the South. He is going to praise the men as all made, in his words, from the same sterling material. These men are standing together in defense of the Florida settlers. These volunteers from Louisiana to South Carolina are not only uniting against a common enemy, Cohen writes that they are also gallant volunteers, again in his words, emanating from one family, all sons of the South. So, the violence of this conflict, the violence of indigenous dispossession, certainly offers a point of common cause. The Second Seminole War, for example, is going to help bind South Carolinians and white Southerners across the region in this collaborative effort to purge the Florida Peninsula of its indigenous people. But it is going to be the suffering that they do legitimately endure in this undertaking that gets remembered and cemented as part of this unifying legacy for white Southerners well after this conflict ends. So I'd like to use the example of what happens to the Summer brothers from Newberry, South Carolina, to illustrate this point. We see in August 1836, again, a very blurry image here, the Charleston Daily Courier will announce the deaths of Nicholas and John Summer. The paper is going to be very succinct, basically reporting that their deaths occurred at Tampa Bay on June 13th and 16th while they are serving in Florida as volunteers. News of their passing certainly provides a reminder of the risks so many white men are taking, but also begins the memorialization process that ties together their sacrifice, the Newberry community in South Carolina, and where they fought and died on the Florida Peninsula. So while the newspaper obituary here gives a very succinct notice of these men's death, private correspondence to the family I uncovered at the South Caroliniana Library reveals a far more horrific experience that they will endure prior to their demise. The Summer Brothers' story basically begins with their arrival in St. Augustine as two brothers who are volunteering for this conflict. Landing in St. Augustine, like thousands of other volunteers will, they have the intention in this opening phase of the war to march across the Florida Peninsula, seeking out Seminole Indians, combating them, taking them prisoner for expulsion, or pushing them further south. But on March 30th, not long into their march, near modern-day Deltona, Florida, the volunteers are going to first engage the Seminole. And members of the South Carolina militia are going to be brazen and charge ahead into what Volunteer describes as becoming a chaotic skirmish, with the enemy dashing from behind trees and leaping from one to another like squirrels. Another Carolinian is going to record that the marsh where they're fighting is so thick and boggy that they couldn't get in on horseback. But through this foliage, a bullet will strike Nicholas Summer. The shot is going to pierce his thigh and throw him from his horse. A fellow volunteer who helps rescue Nicholas remembered the incident years later, basically describing how Nicholas hit the ground immobilized, unable to move, and fearing for his life, particularly fearing that the Seminole would scalp him. Nicholas Summer is going to survive this initial wound. He will continue on, presumably on a medical litter, across the peninsula to Tampa Bay on Florida's west Gulf Coast. Army surgeons at the fort are going to assess his wounds and note that the bullet struck Nicholas about 4 inches above his knee and passed through his left thigh, breaking the bone entirely. Over the next 2 months, Nicholas's condition will deteriorate as his brother John watches from his bedside. U.S. Army surgeons consider amputating the leg, but it becomes clear that Nicholas couldn't survive the procedure. They think about potentially putting him on a boat and sending him to Mobile, where he could get better care, but again, they don't think he can survive the voyage. So Nicholas Summer is just left there in this medical tent in Tampa Bay, deteriorating day by day. As Nicholas grows worse, his brother John writes home letters describing basically what is happening, giving a chronicle of the pain and suffering that Nicholas is going to go through. His brother John describes how his brother's wound begins to fester, producing what John describes as a very offensive discharge. In May, John describes Nicholas's appetite has somewhat failed him. He is very feeble. His arms are somewhat paralyzed from his being forced to lie in the same position. On June 13th, 2.5 months after being shot, Nicholas Summer died at Fort Brooke and is buried outside the walls. But Nicholas's death will not be the end of what becomes this South Carolina family tragedy. While tending to his brother, John contracts a disease that is described in letters as a bilious typhoid. On the day of Nicholas's funeral, John is so ill that he can't bring himself to sit himself up to look out the window to watch his brother's burial. And 3 days after, John dies of his illness and is buried in Florida alongside his brother. So the Summer brothers family are going to learn in agonizing detail how these two young men died, thanks to letters that are sent home, first written by John and then written by a medical attendant named Robert Pratt. At the request of John Summer, Pratt is going to give a very detailed account of what these two men had endured, giving a very unsettling sort of graphic depiction of both the wound and the disease. Pratt will write, due to rheumatism in his arms and general weakness, he is obliged to wash Nicholas and feed him like an infant. But worse than all, Nicholas could not use a bedpan. In consequence of Nicholas's invariable position, an extensive abscess formed at the lower part of his back, gradually expanding upwards, and finally terminating a life of suffering seldom equaled. Pratt is going to describe John's final days, explaining John had been suffering and been obliged to witness the ongoing sufferings of his brother Nicholas and becomes delirious as a result. Before he passes, John's going to give special instructions to inform his father of their condition, and after he had relapsed again into a state of mental derangement, death at last put a period to John's suffering. So in the wake of their deaths, a family friend in Newbury will memorialize the sacrifice of the Summer brothers. He will write that with honor they fell far away in the land of the stranger, but death cannot sever the bonds of our love. Buried in graves far from home, the friend continued, the deaths could not efface the record of their story. Intimately tying these two distant places together at Newberry, South Carolina, and Tampa, Florida. Coincidentally, within days of the Summer brothers' deaths, community leaders in Camden, South Carolina, not far from Newberry, presumably serving in the same militia company as these men from Newberry, will hold a celebratory dinner to honor the state's volunteers. The brothers from Newberry will fight alongside these Camden volunteers, and the Camden community will largely celebrate all the efforts of South Carolinians here. So as part of this Camden, South Carolina dinner celebration, men are going to offer a round of toasts, basically honoring what they expect to be the quick and easy defeat of the Florida Indians. In attendance, newspapers are going to write that a man named Mr. Matheson is going to present a toast to the Creek and the Seminole, stating, "May they soon be made as quiet and harmless as the Indian upon the Camden Market House." When I first read this quote, it was something that I did not personally have any sort of reference to. But upon further investigation, Matheson's toast is referencing an iron weather vane that is cut into the silhouette of the mid-18th century Catawba war captain King Hagler that sits atop Camden's public market. Matheson and his toast essentially serve twofold. One, it is demonstrating that he hopes the Seminole and an ongoing war with Creek Indians in Georgia is going to provide a point of comparison to this tokenized depiction of an indigenous person as a preferable foil to the warring Creek and Seminole. And then we see again this invocation of a long deceased Native American who is no longer causing problems for the Camden community. We see in another toast, attendees are going to celebrate the volunteers' willingness to risk their lives in Florida. The dinner's organizers will profess, if the blood of Carolinians has not enriched the soil, it has been freely periled. With the toast taking place just days after the death of a second Summer brother, the sacrifices of men like Nicholas and John constitute an anointing of the land from their home through this blood. Their deaths and their burials in Florida now bind these distant places, and the memory of their deaths will build connections across succeeding generations. We see this built into Camden's and Newberry's, we see this built into Newberry's memory of their service pretty quickly. In Newberry, the memory of the Summer brothers' anguish-inducing deaths is going to resonate, not just for their gallantry and honor, but as a tale of unification among white men for the remainder of this century. In 1892, the publication of the Annals of Newberry is going to chronicle an account of Nicholas Summer's service in Florida alongside a local rival who volunteered with him. The nature of their dispute is unspecified, but it is something that established a grave difficulty between Nicholas Summer and his rival Jacob King. And at one point it had required the men being separated to spare them from taking swings at each other. But when the pair served side by side in Florida, King will actually be instrumental in protecting Summer after he is shot through the leg. According to Newberry's community lore and what gets written down in this history of the community, Jacob King supposedly cast aside their rivalry and risked his own life to protect Summer during that skirmish with the Seminole Indians. It was King who had ridden out on horseback, putting himself between an injured Nicholas who had been shot and fallen from his horse, and the Florida Indians who were still opening fire on the South Carolinians. According to local tradition, after the skirmish passed, King says that he enjoyed a luxury of feeling he had never before experienced, when during the mutual pressure of our hands, Summer supposedly said to him, "I can never forget your kindness." After securing Summer with the company medics, King will never see Summer alive again. And reportedly, Jacob King said this was his greatest regret. So it's through the experience of the Summer brothers that we can see how this violence against Florida Indians creates certainly a common cause to build bonds between white men in the South. And in the aftermath of this violence, the community will perpetuate the memory of their sacrifice as a noble cause where fighting side by side against Native Americans can mend disputes and will be celebrated for generations to come. So I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to listen about my work. I'd certainly like to thank several organizations who made research for this project possible. And I would encourage you all, if you are interested in learning more about Native American history in the American South, certainly take a look at my book. But my book is published in a series with the University of Alabama Press, known as the Indians and Southern History series. We have 3 preceding volumes in the series that look at various aspects of this intersection between Native American history and the history of the American South, with this premise that it is essentially impossible to really understand the history of this region without accounting for indigenous perspectives and their foundational influences on this place. So thank you again, and I'm happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability.
You can get it in hardback or paperback.
Certainly, yeah, I'd encourage purchase a paperback. Have them for $30. You can take cash, Venmo, or check.
Okay. And we're going to buy one for the Historical Society Library. So
Well, thank you.
have one of those. Thank you so much.
All right, it was a pleasure.
It's very interesting, and you know, we always wondered about the Southern of the Indians. There was like white supremacy these days or something.
for you.
Oh, excellent. One question. Good.
Okay, on your theory about the Southerners and the Indians, why 50 or less than, well, let's see, 1860, 15 years later, all the Indians in the Indian Territory joined with the South to fight the Union?
So all of them don't.
Well, most of them do.
There is going to be a split in Indian country in Oklahoma, and it is going to play out as much a civil war there as it does for the nation. We will see, as I talked about with the Van family, wealthy indigenous people among the Cherokee are going to be slaveholders, and they have an invested interest in sustaining that system as well. There's also going to be overtures that the Confederacy will make in terms of making promises to respecting indigenous sovereignty. Whether they actually ever plan to follow through on that or not is very ambiguous. But it'd certainly be a little bit of a mischaracterization to say that they all sided with the Confederacy.
Vast majority of them, yeah, do it.
Another question, sure.
Along those same lines, but a different tack, in your research, did you uncover one of the motivating reasons for the unity of these southern states, as so many enslaved people were running away to Florida, and once it had changed after the Adams-Onis Treaty, the fact that the Seminole might regain control, that was a threat?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I see as a motivating factor for Florida's for the U.S. acquisition of Florida is specifically to put a stop to that. And a lot of other scholars, in terms of Spanish Florida, refuge for enslaved Southerners to flee to is certainly well documented. We can look to newspaper articles, local communities of the time period, with slaveholders saying, why are you allowing this to happen? You're not allowing us first to recover people, formerly enslaved people who make it to Florida, and then they're then going to actively support U.S. military intervention into Florida to provoke a conflict. The United States invades Florida several times under dubious circumstances each time, and that is certainly one of the motivating factors for it.